Hello and welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, the Winter Paralympics in Italy are about to begin, but the build-up has been overshadowed by controversy over the participation of athletes from Russia and Belarus under their national symbols. Several countries are protesting, with some boycotting the opening ceremony, while Polish public broadcaster TVP says it will interrupt coverage when these delegations appear. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss is Jon Carter, our sports correspondent at TVP World, covering the games. Hello, Jon. Welcome to World Talks.
Good morning, Ben.
So, how unusual is this for the build-up to the games to be overshadowed by a political controversy like this?
It's not particularly untypical for there to be controversies prior to the games. You know, it's happened quite a lot. I'd say what is perhaps a little bit untypical to be such a sort of long-running theme to be in the run-up to the games. So, of course, both the Olympics and the Paralympics have had this ongoing theme of, you know, should we, shouldn't we, etc. for years, but or at least since the full-scale invasion. Right? But in terms of controversies, you know, we can think back perhaps to the controversy over, you know, the China-Tibet issue back in 2008, and that kind of overshadowed the beginning of the 2008 Games in Beijing. So, you know, there's many such examples. Even back to the Cold War, I think there's in the 70s with Los Angeles, big protest before that. It's not untypical for this to happen. But as I said, the more, perhaps slightly more extraordinary thing in this regard is, you know, this is a really ongoing theme.
Right, and we're talking about allowing the Russians, Belarusians to compete. Also curious about whether or not this will create some sort of knock-on effect and that would have an impact on future sports events. Do you think that this decision will influence other kind of future events to come?
Yeah, potentially. And, you know, there has been a lot of talk in this regard. Will the Paralympics, by allowing the Russians and Belarusians to compete under their own flags, with their own national anthems, does that open the door for other sports? Does it sort of give the green light to say, yeah, this is now acceptable, you know? And because everything with these decisions is very much about sort of perception and alignment with others. It's sort of, you know, each different it's similar to politics. People are waiting for cues from others. Is this okay now? And so if we think about it in terms of what we've seen in other sports, big sporting bodies, well, let's first of all take the example, interesting one with World Athletics actually, is that they have a complete blanket banning of the Russians and Belarusians. They can't compete in any form. However, when we look into something like the Olympics, then we can see they can compete, but there is a certain process involved. You know, let's ensure that they don't, the athletes don't have any affiliation with the Russian army, etc. And then also they can't compete under their own flag, must be individuals, they can't be in team sports. And then we have things like the big sport, for example, in football. Now, Russia and Belarus can't compete, but we've heard in recent months the head of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, is very sort of pally with Vladimir Putin, and he's been making these noises along the lines of, well, you know, we shouldn't punish the footballers, they're just footballers, come on, let's not make this political, you know, sort of coming very much with that line. So we can see there's a lot of different sports or a lot of different stages, but I think, yes, because this Paralympic issue is garnering a lot of interest, there is potential for it to open the door for other sporting bodies to sort of shift towards allowing the Russians and Belarusians to compete.
All right, you mentioned earlier that, well, some people who argue for the inclusion of these countries is the fact that they think, or they say that sports should be neutral. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, you see, this all depends on, I don't think there is such a thing as a blanket sort of, yes, it should be exclusive from or not connected with politics, etc. I think you have to take each case on its own individual merits. Now, if you want to look at it from the kind of Ukrainian perspective, you can completely understand why for them it's very, you can't separate the two. From their point of view, you know, the Ukrainian Sports Ministry said that over 600 Ukrainian athletes have been killed during the war. Over 800 of their sporting facilities have been bombed and destroyed. So from the Ukrainian perspective, it's completely intertwined. How can you separate that? It's directly affected their sport. Sort of, maybe if we're thinking of it from the sort of perspective of, you know, when someone's really trying to gain an advantage by taking a sort of political stance within sport, maybe that's something different. But I think in this case, I would say the Ukrainians have a fairly strong argument to sort of say, well, they're inherently intertwined.
Right, and I think it doesn't help Russia's case, where a lot of their competing athletes also have ties to the military and are very vocal about it as well, even on major sporting events. But do you think that's one reason why the inclusion of Russian Belarusian athletes under their national flags sparked such a strong reaction?
Yeah, it is. You know, there was a lot of Ukrainian politicians, including President Zelensky, who came out and completely condemned it. And, you know, like I said, if you can't, it's very difficult to separate the two. And I think maybe what is not being said is the idea that what the knock-on effect is going to be. You know, I don't think people specifically want to say, well, look, once you do this, think about what's going to come. And, you know, we could be sitting here in a couple of years' time, I hope not, but maybe the war will still even be going on, and we could be in a situation where Russians competing has been completely normalised, they're back in, they're competing, and, you know, they're pushing that boundary further and making comments about, you know, supporting Putin or the war, whatever. And, you know, it all begins with when you topple that first domino, right? So I think that's really inherent in this kind of the concern.
And I think a lot of people who are concerned about it, I've been talking about boycotts as well, and several countries are already saying that they will be boycotting at least the Parade of the Nations. How significant is that protest?
Well, it's rather symbolic, I think. So, yeah, I think we have 7 or 8 countries who've said that they will boycott the opening ceremony. And, in fact, even Germany yesterday saying that, well, they won't boycott the whole ceremony, but they will not take part in the kind of flag parade, which is part of the opening ceremony. And I think it's, you know, you can see that it's very much coming from this region, Poland, the Baltics, but also the Netherlands, as I said, Germany, taking a stance against this. You know, how much effect does it have? I don't know. It's difficult because, well, what we should understand is why has the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, come to this decision? Well, specifically, they distance themselves from this. They say, well, we haven't made this decision, it's our members. And, you know, how does that operate? Well, people vote as to whether, you know, we should continue the suspension of Russian and Belarusian athletes. And then it comes down to the 6 individual major disciplines within the Winter Olympics, and each one body has its own sort of, they decide, their members decide, are we going to allow this? Well, interestingly, for example, with the Snowboarding and Skiing Federation, they said, no, we will not allow Russians and Belarusians to compete at the Winter Paralympics, but the Russians and Belarusians took that to the Sport of Arbitration, and they won their appeal. So it got reversed that way. So it's kind of been externalised and then brought back in. So we can see that there is, where there's a will, there's a way, perhaps.
Right. With all this bureaucracy to try to delegate the responsibility a little bit. So it is perplexing why they came to that decision in the first place.
I mean, yes and no, yeah, because again, some of them who are have a big distance to perhaps the war in Ukraine, etc., For them, they're not thinking perhaps so deeply about it, and they're simply saying politics and sport, they shouldn't be mixed. Here are some athletes, they want to compete, end of story. You know, and if you're going to take that kind of view, I think, I do understand it. If you're just going to really boil it down and be as simplistic as that, it's a very difficult argument to sort of confront, because not many people are going to say, well, I'd argue against that as just a statement. Right. But that's a statement in isolation without the broader context.
And like you mentioned, it's very important to see whether it's going to have any ripple effect going forward. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on World Talks.
Thank you, Ben.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.